In this video, I'm going to walk you through the leadership principle of ownership, what it means, what qualities exhibit it, and then walk you through an example of how to structure your job interview answer to best display it. Welcome back to Interview Out, where our mission is to help 100,000 people land their dream job. And the reason we use the Amazon leadership principles is because it does not matter the role, the level, or even if the company understands what the Amazon leadership principles are. It doesn't matter. If you use the frameworks that we teach you in these videos, I guarantee you that you will show up better in your job interview. A couple of months ago, I launched a free tool called GuessTheLP.com, and for that time, I've been watching the data to see what I could learn. The entire purpose of the tool was to help candidates like yourself try to match interview questions with Amazon leadership principles. The site was built as a guessing game where you can go and basically utilize my question data bank and see if you can match questions to the Amazon leadership principles. Always the product manager, I wanted to see what I could learn from the data that was coming from the website. And a couple of weeks ago, I added a button that would allow individuals to give up on a question if they didn't know the answer and they just wanted to get the answer right away. I've been tracking that data to see where you have been giving up the most. Over the course of the last 28 days, it turns out that the leadership principle of ownership is the one that you've given up on the most. So what is ownership? Well, here's how Amazon defines it in their leadership principles. Leaders are owners. They think long-term and they don't sacrifice long-term value for short-term results. They act on behalf of the entire company beyond just their own team. They never say, "That's not my job." Again, the important thing here is it does not matter if you're interviewing at Amazon or not. If the company you're interviewing at understands the Amazon leadership principles or not. If you show up in your interview and you can answer a question that is clearly targeting ownership as a leadership principle, if you've structured your answer to target the leadership principle and not some imagined question that you may or may not get, your preparation steps will be far, far easier, your stress will be far, far lower, and your answers will be the better for it. One of the things I took away from my time at Amazon was how they run their loops. Now, generally it's 4 to 6 interviews of about an hour long, and everybody gets assigned a leadership principle, and that's fine. But sometimes those leadership principles are assigned in a, what we'll call it, a structured way, and sometimes it's just, well, here's some leadership principles we'd like to focus on. A really well-run process will, in fact, assign leadership principles by the type of role. So, for example, if you're a product manager, there's a set that you would definitely want to target, and for the loop of 4 to 6 interviews, well, they'll assign them to the people who are on the hiring loop. This is a practice I've taken away from Amazon and use it in all of the hiring teams since then. And when I try to help other companies that I work with, I walk them through how they can rethink their process for their hiring. And essentially what we do is we have a grid and we assign leadership principles by role and by level. Because what we want to make sure we do is when we're talking to candidates and they come in and we talk to them about the things that they've done in their experience, we want to make sure that they are capable of doing the role, they're capable of doing it at that company, and in fact, demonstrating that they can excel. So for any given role, the leadership principles in this grid are marked as required, meaning, hey, you know what, we want to make sure we cover this. Important, meaning, we'd like to cover it, but it's likely covered by another leadership principle, but, if we want to throw it in there, cool. And not required, which means, it's not really required for the purposes of the interview. It doesn't mean we don't want to see it from the candidate through maybe their answers. They kind of tag an answer with additional leadership principles or some information comes through, but it's definitely not something we're testing for in the context of the interview. So now let's talk about how ownership applies by role. Let's start with, my bread and butter, product management. Well, does it matter? Sort of. And I know that's going to sound crazy because most product managers believe that they're the CEO of their product, blah, 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 blah. And that's true. But at the end of the day, ownership is really more important for the more senior level product managers. And there's other kind of leadership principles that you're definitely going to want to focus on for the more junior level product managers, where ownership just it comes and it's important, but it's not required. Now let's talk about engineers. Whether you're an IC or you're a senior level manager, ownership, is it required? No, it's not. It's important for sure, and certainly more important for the junior ICs, right? Because they have to take ownership of their little piece of code and their feature. But the more senior you are, ownership will come through in other things. It's definitely not required for an interview loop. Let's talk about program managers. Program managers are generally regarded as, well, the people that run around with the clipboards and make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do. So is ownership required? Yeah, you bet it is. Because at the end of the day, they need to make sure that stuff is getting done. And they can't just say, well, it wasn't my job to write that code, or it wasn't my job to get that thing done. They can't do that. They don't have the ability to do that. So at all levels, program managers really do need to show ownership because they kind of are the glue that kind of keeps everything going. It's going to vary depending on the company, how they leverage their program managers. But generally, these are the folks that are concerned with the how and the when. BizDev, partnership, sales, solutions types. Anyone who has a day-to-day interaction with customers, frontline interaction with customers, yeah, you got to show ownership because you are the face of the company as far as customers are concerned. You are the person they're interacting with. You can't just say, well, it's not my job. I didn't write the feature. It's not my job. I'm not responsible for that. You're interfacing with the customer. Your responsibility. You have to show ownership. So now let's pretend you're a candidate and you're going for a role and you want to prepare your stories in advance of your interviews. And you're going to focus on the leadership principle of ownership. What does that look like? How do you exhibit that you're demonstrating ownership? There's a couple of ways that you can do that when you're examining your stories as you prepare them. First, Do you understand what your role is? Do you understand what your responsibilities are? And do you understand how that compares to other roles within the team, within the company? Second, are you thinking about the outcomes of your work? Are you thinking long-term? Are you willing to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term goals? Is what you're doing scalable? Is it repeatable? That's how you show ownership. Owners don't think about the wins today. They think about the wins over time. Finally, are you willing to provide feedback to others on the team? I'm not just talking about people that work for you. You might be an IC. Are you willing to look around, and when you see something is not going well, you see somebody who's not performing well or maybe struggling, whether they admit it or not, do they need help? Do they need coaching? And are you willing to provide it without being asked to do so? A question you're likely asking yourself is, well, okay, that's great for ICs, but what if I'm a people manager? Let me tell you, there are a few extra steps you want to make sure that you're exhibiting when you're showing your stories for ownership, if you're creating your stories, which is, look, as a people manager, you want to make sure that you demonstrate you're fostering an environment where your team members feel that they are empowered and have the autonomy to make decisions. One of the ways we did this at Amazon was to talk about one-way and two-way doors, right? You want to push as many decisions down the chain of command if they're two-way doors, meaning a decision is made, look around, look at the data. Oh, we made a mistake. We can go back through the door and fix it. That's a two-way door. A one-way door is, once you make this decision, you're committed. You can't really undo it, or you can't undo it easily or without high cost. Those are the decisions you want to hold on to at the highest levels. And obviously the higher the impact, the higher the cost is, the further up the chain that goes. But as a manager, can you demonstrate that you're facilitating within your organization autonomy of thinking, right? A willingness to make decisions. If you've watched through my playlist about walking through how to prepare your stories using the STAR format plus my FAQ addendum to that, great, you're all set. If you haven't, at the end of this video, I'll put one of those cards that has a link to the playlist. While I'm going to walk through a specific example of ownership and story development in this video, I'm going to do so at a high level. I'm not going to include specifics from my resume as I did in one of my other videos. I just want to walk you through how to think about the types of questions for your FAQ as part of your story preparation that you would utilize for your story. The first step when you're preparing stories for your interview preparation, first step, when you take something, an experience, something off your resume, something from a previous performance review that you want to make sure you discuss and discuss well in an interview and prepare to discuss it, is to assign it to a leadership principle. Just pick one. It might apply to multiple leadership principles, and that's totally fine. Generally, don't go beyond 3, right? One story for up to, call it 3 leadership principles, but pick one. In this case, we're talking about ownership. Step 2. Part of the FAQ process that I created, and this is what I did for myself when I was looking for C-level roles and VP level roles as I was leaving Amazon and beyond, right, was to not just assign the story to a leadership principle. That's not sufficient to prepare your story, right? That's, okay, cool, you're ready to talk about it, but how do you talk about it in a structured way? And the first thing I had to do was make sure that I picked a Northstar question. The reason I did this was to make sure that as I was preparing my story, I kind of understood what I was hoping to get to, knowing that the story might actually apply to multiple questions, but having that Northstar question was just helpful in guiding the thought process and how I went about my process and making sure it was straight in my mind. So for this specific example, we'll just pick one for ownership, which is, tell me about a time that you saw a peer who was clearly struggling and you decided to help. Step 3, and this is where you do the story development. Now, I use the STAR format largely because, well, we did it at Amazon. It was kind of beaten in our skulls. This is how you evaluate answers. And it's actually very, very good for evaluating answers that candidates give you in interviews, right? Because you want to understand if the candidate is presenting you a story that has a situation, a task, an action, and a result. Cool. I like the STAR format because it also helps divide up your content into 3 logical parts: situation, task, action, result. Why do I do this? Well, that format forces linear storytelling. There's a beginning, situation, task, a middle, action, and an end, result. Having that content in that way is telling a story that the human mind is optimized and evolved to understand. We understand stories from a beginning, middle, end. Books, beginning, middle, end, right? TV shows, plays, movies, act 1, act 2, act 3. This is how we want to process the stories that we hear. So it's best to adhere to that, as opposed to, which is, I see this all the time in the mock interviews that I do at interview@.com, and that I would see when people would come in to interview for jobs or I was on the hiring loop, is you would ask them a question and they would kind of try to, and then they would ad lib a story, which ends up being this non-linear recounting of something that it just doesn't have a clear beginning, middle, and an end. And it's just not a good experience. So as I evolved my own process when I was leaving Amazon and beyond, I wanted to build on what I had been doing. And up to that point, I had evolved to what I call the speechwriter phase, which is, preparing for my interviews, these C-level jobs, chief product officer, etc. I would prepare by imagining all the questions I might get and writing out these long speeches. And I guarantee you there's a bunch of you out there who have done exactly this. You've got a large Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, and it's just got a bunch of stories, and you've written out paragraphs and paragraphs of text. And here's the problem. It's really not effective. And here's why. Because I wasn't answering the core questions that really mattered for that story. I know that I personally have been guilty of this in the past, being a speechwriter. I want you to go ahead and comment below if you are a speechwriter. Write speechwriter below. The FAQ format that I came up with, again, was stealing something great from Amazon, which is all of the docs within Amazon, these documents that drive meetings, are basically in an FAQ format. And the reason for this is because the information density in writing out a 2-page document with the FAQ means that, 1, you can't BS your way through that meeting. 2, anybody who didn't attend the meeting gets that document, that digital artifact will tell them everything they needed to know about what was discussed in that meeting. And 3, and this is the most important part, is if I'm running the meeting, I have to make sure I answer all the important questions ahead of time. So when we go and we sit down, I can demonstrate that I've thought through all of the things that we need to talk about, and it can't be, let me get back to you, I don't know. That's not an effective meeting. Can't do that. So for demonstrating ownership with your story development, we're now going to walk through the FAQ part of this so that you can have better story development tied to ownership. For each of the 3 sections, situation, task, action, and result, I'm going to walk through 5 FAQ questions that you can use as feeder questions to start your process. Now look, the 5 questions for each, it's a starting point. In general, you're going to want to enumerate all the questions that you would probably want to answer for that section of your answer, because you're going to know, as you think about it, what are the questions that you, as a leader or someone within the business, if someone was telling you work that they did, that you would ask. Write out all the questions. Don't write any answers, write out all the questions. Situation, task, action, result. Reorder them and then draw a line. The reordering is so that the story naturally flows. The drawing a line is like, okay, well I can only cover so much. Generally the line is no more than probably 6 FAQ questions. And here's why. Because each one of the answers to each of those FAQ questions will have 1 to 5 sentences. Let's say you go 5 sentences, 6 questions, that's 30 sentences. That's about a page of text. You don't want to be speaking for more than a page of text in any interview you do. Why? Well, because if you're speaking for more than a page of text, you're really not inviting the interviewer to engage with you. You're speaking for a very long time. So each section of your answer, again, situation, task, action, result, you want to keep it under about a page of text. Once you've written out all those answers and you look at it, your story that you tell in your interview will naturally evolve into how you tell stories. It's not a speech. You don't write the way you speak. I guarantee you don't, unless you're a professional speechwriter, which means if you write out paragraphs of text and then you try to recite that from memory, it's not going to come across as authentic. But if you know these are the 6 most important questions I need to answer as I'm recounting the tale of the situation task for this specific thing, your story will naturally evolve so that you can tell it again and again and again. And you might tell it 100 times and have 100 scripts, but you're going to have 1 story. Okay, let's get into it. What are the FAQ questions that I would put into my story if I was developing a story for ownership? And my Northstar question was, tell me about a time that you saw a peer who's clearly struggling and you decided to step in and help. Question 1, what was your role at the time? I see this again and again. People forget to start their answers with, what was your role? What were you doing? Make it a sentence or 2, but at least give me context as to who you were. Question 2, to whom were you giving the feedback? It's important to understand who they are, what their role was in relation to you, and maybe 1 sentence on what they were responsible for. Question 3, what was the specific issue that this person was facing? Or, on what thing were they failing to live up to the expectations that were being set? And as an addendum to this, I would add, what were the ramifications of allowing that person to continue down the path that they were on? Question 5, why did you feel it was appropriate to deliver this feedback? Was the situation that no one was saying anything? Did you just feel like, you had an area of expertise that maybe they didn't have that you could help out? Set the tone. Help me understand why you decided to step in. Question 5, why hadn't anybody else provided feedback? What was going on within the organization that either their manager or other people around you, why hadn't anybody else given feedback? This is one of those where you may not know the answer, and that's totally fine. These are my 5 questions that I would start with if I was preparing my situation and task for this question for ownership. And now we're on to the action section. Those are the 5 questions for situation and task. Here's the next 5 questions that I would want to set up as part of my preparation, story preparation for action for this question in ownership. Number 1, most important question. What action did you take? What did you do? Walk me through it. Question number 2, why did you take this course of action? Right? The first question is the what did you do? The second question is why did you do it? Both of these are important. Start with the what, then get to the why. Question 3, did you consult with anyone else within your organization, within your team, your manager, whatever, before you took this course of action to deliver feedback? It's helpful to understand if You are a team player. Did you just kind of make the command decision? It's a two-way door. Maybe it was a kind of gentle feedback. It wasn't a big deal. Hey, sure, go. But if it was something big, maybe a technical decision where you really disagreed with somebody, but you wanted to check in with somebody else, it's good to demonstrate that you kind of look around the organization and you utilize the resources that are available to you. Question number 4, and this is one that I really like to see when I get answers from people, and often I don't get it, so I will ask this as a follow-up question in my interviews. But if you prepare ahead of time and you're ready to talk about it, cool. Include it in your answer, it'll be better. And that question is, what alternatives did you consider and reject? And finally, question 5, what was the timeline for this course of action? How long did it take you to come to this decision? How long did it take you to deliver the feedback? What was the timeline? Okay, and now we're moving on to the results section. What actually happened? This is where you can show that you saw a situation, you made a decision to act, and now here's what happened. Question number 1, what was the outcome of your feedback? When you talk about the outcome of the feedback, you want to talk about, what did the person do? Did they change their course? Did they make different decisions? Did you improve processes? Whatever it was, what was the outcome of this course of action? Question number 2, do you feel like they responded appropriately? It's really important sometimes to talk about the context within an organization, and you might be working with someone who's just difficult to work with, and you offered to give them help, and they just rejected it out of hand. Or maybe they were difficult, didn't want to accept it at first, but you continue to work at it, and over the course of several meetings, you got to the right outcome. Walk me through the interview, or walk me through that. Help me understand how you work as a person. Question number 3, and this is good for a bit of introspection, but also a way of kind of allowing hindsight to be 20/20, which is looking back, do you feel like you gave the best or the most appropriate feedback to this person? Question 4, in keeping with the theme of introspection, were you right about the ramifications that you avoided as a result of taking this course of action and delivering this feedback to this person? Were you right? You can look back now and understand, well, did you change things a lot? Did it change a little? Did it make no difference at all? But were you right? And finally, question 5, and this is usually a follow-up question from a good interviewer if they really kind of poke and they really want to understand how you act as a team member, which is, how do you like to receive feedback? See, it's important to not just be able to give feedback and be able to talk to people and say, hey, you might want to do this better. Maybe you want to change this up, do this differently. But it's important to understand how you as an individual like to receive feedback so that you are aware of how you are going to react to other people coming to you. And that develops a sense of empathy over time, right? You understand that everybody's different, everybody receives feedback differently. And so how do you like to receive feedback? Hopefully this walkthrough of ownership as a leadership principle was helpful for you as you start down your path of story development for your job interviews. We talked about what ownership is as a leadership principle, how to exhibit it as an individual contributor or as a people manager, and for what roles it really is important to show it or prepare for it ahead of your interviews. And finally, we walked through how to do your FAQ development for your stories. Listen, the FAQ process was one, I borrowed it from Amazon, but I used it when I was preparing for my senior level roles. And the reason I did it was because I wanted to make sure that I was answering the questions that were important for what it was I was prepared to talk about. We've all done it. We've sat in meetings and we hear people droning on and on and on about something that they've done, but they fail to answer a bunch of basic questions that they probably should have answered. That's how you get better prepared for the interview. This is why I loved the FAQ process that I borrowed from Amazon, how they run their meetings, because it forces you as the presenter to make sure you're covering the content that's most important for the other people who are participating in the room. It's no different in a job interview. If you're going to come in, you're basically asking for a job. You need to demonstrate to me, the interviewer, that you can do the job and do it really, really well. And you do that by talking about past work. Well, great. If you're going to come in and talk about past work and you want to talk about a certain situation that demonstrated ownership, and in this case it was, tell me about a time that you delivered feedback to a peer who was clearly struggling, answer these. These are a starting point basic questions. You might have others, and that's great. But if you answer these questions as part of your structured answer preparation and you can tell that story in an authentic way, your interview answers are going to be so much better than somebody who tries to ad-lib their way through it and doesn't answer a number of these questions and leaves it to the interviewer to ask the follow-up questions, which if they're a lazy interviewer, someone who's busy, tired, whatever, or even just a bad interviewer, they're not going to ask those follow-up questions. And then they walk out of the room with a different impression of you than what you could have done if you took ownership. You see what I did there? Took ownership of the interview itself and drove all of the conversations to the logical conclusion you wanted them to get to. Take ownership of your interview process.